Remember Tipper Gore and the whole Parents Music Resource Center thing back in the
Yeah.
80s?
Yeah.
Talk about pearl clutching.
Mm.
It feels like a lifetime ago. But that whole panic over dangerous song lyrics was just a taste of what was to come in the 90s.
Right.
The 90s had its own version, the political correctness panic, and let me tell you, it was a doozy.
It really was.
And that's what we're diving into today, this whole political correctness panic of the 1990s. We've got a stack of articles, books, even a vintage SNL skit, all painting a picture of how this media frenzy took hold.
It's fascinating how these cultural anxieties seem to echo through the generations. I mean, we might roll our eyes at those explicit lyrics warning labels now, but back then people were genuinely worried about the corrupting influence of music, like rock and rap.
Oh, totally. And it's not just about music. It reveals a lot about how certain groups in society try to frame themselves as victims.
Even when they hold most of the cards, yeah.
Exactly. So if you were around back then, get ready for some serious nostalgia.
Yeah.
And if not, well, you'll gain some insight into how fear and outrage get amplified in the media, whether it's cancel culture today or satanic panic in the past.
Right, right.
Both are classic examples of what sociologists call moral panics, these intense waves of public concern over something that's perceived as a threat to societal values.
Yeah, and these panics often rely on anecdotal evidence and exaggerated claims, like a wildfire of misinformation.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole political correctness thing. Where did this term even come from? I mean, it feels so 90s, but the roots go deeper, right?
Oh, yeah, much deeper. The term itself pops up in the 1930s within communist regimes, believe it or not.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it was used to enforce ideological conformity.
So from the get-go, it had this association with authoritarianism.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting. In the 80s and 90s, the term took on a whole new life. It started as this ironic term used by leftists, almost like a self-aware critique of their own language and policies. But then conservatives kind of flipped the script. They weaponized the term political correctness and turned it into this bludgeon to attack anything they perceived as overly liberal or progressive.
Oh, interesting. So it became this catch-all phrase for anything that challenged traditional values.
Precisely. And college campuses became the main target, those hotbeds of free thought and expression. Conservatives had been targeting higher education for decades, painting them as bastions of liberalism. But the late 80s and 90s saw a real escalation of these attacks. They poured funding into conservative think tanks, organizations designed to promote specific ideologies, and campus newspapers, all with the aim of pushing back against what they saw as a dangerous leftist agenda in academia.
And there were some key figures driving this narrative, right? One name that kept popping up in my research was William F. Buckley, Jr. His book, God and Man at Yale, was published back in 1951, but it seemed to lay the groundwork for this whole attack on universities.
Yeah, Buckley's book was essentially a blueprint for how to frame higher education as a threat to American values. He argued that Yale, and by extension, many universities, had abandoned their traditional religious and moral foundations and had become havens for secular humanism and liberal ideologies.
So he set the stage for this idea that universities were indoctrinating students with dangerous ideas.
Exactly.
Got it.
And this narrative gained momentum in the following decades, culminating in this full-blown panic about political correctness in the 90s. It was
Right.
like they were dusting off Buckley's playbook and giving it a 90s makeover.
And this time, the enemy wasn't just Marxist professors. It was these shadowy figures known as social justice warriors.
Right. Ah, yes, the infamous SJWs. This was a rebranding of that old Marxist professor trope. By the late 80s and early 90s, conservatives were less concerned with communism and more focused on what they saw as this insidious form of liberalism that was infecting everything from college campuses to popular culture.
And they had a whole arsenal of books to back up their claims. I'm thinking of titles like The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, Tenured Radicals by Roger Kimball, and Prof. Scam by Charles Sykes. These books were bestsellers, right?
They were hugely influential, and they were packed with anecdotes and alarming statistics that painted this picture of universities as battlegrounds for this cultural war. But as I was digging into my research for this deep dive, I noticed something interesting about a lot of these claims.
What's that?
Well, they often relied on anecdotal evidence, cherry-picked stories, and misleading interpretations of events. It's like they were taking isolated incidents, stripping them of context, and presenting them as evidence of this widespread systemic problem.
Okay, you've got to give me an example of this.
Okay, well, Take tenured radicals. There's a whole chapter dedicated to supposed black militancy at Cornell University in the 1960s.
Wow.
Kimball portrays these student protests as this unprovoked, disruptive force on campus. But what he conveniently omits is that these protests were a direct response to some pretty horrific racist incidents on campus, including a burning cross.
Wait, seriously? They were protesting actual hate crimes, and he spun it as them being the aggressors.
Exactly. It's a prime example of how these books manipulated the facts to fit their agenda. They were cherry-picking stories and presenting them in a way that demonized student activism and painted universities as hostile to conservative viewpoints.
It's almost like they were deliberately trying to create this sense of fear and outrage.
Well, it wouldn't be a moral panic without a healthy dose of fear and outrage, right? And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of the PC panic: the rise of victimhood among conservatives.
You're saying that the same people who were complaining about political correctness and censorship were also claiming to be victims.
It sounds paradoxical, but yes. They were very effectively positioning themselves as a marginalized group, claiming that they were the ones being silenced and discriminated against. It was this brilliant, albeit manipulative tactic.
So how did they pull that off?
Well, they co-opted the language of social justice movements.
No.
Instead of focusing on the very real inequalities faced by marginalized communities, they shifted the focus to their own perceived grievances. They argued that political correctness was infringing on their free speech rights, even though they held most of the power in society.
I remember reading this one quote that really sums up this whole victimhood narrative. It's from Robert Weisberg, a political scientist.
Okay.
He said, "We are the queers of the 1990s."
Oh, wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It perfectly captures this sense of aggrievement and this attempt to claim the mantle of the oppressed.
Right.
It's almost like they were saying, hey, we're the real victims here, not those other groups who are actually facing systemic discrimination.
It was a powerful way to deflect criticism and garner sympathy. By co-opting the language of social justice, they could claim that they too were facing oppression.
It was a really savvy strategy. But this panic didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? The media had to be playing a role in spreading these ideas.
Absolutely. The media was instrumental in amplifying these narratives. Mainstream media outlets often uncritically echoed conservative talking points about PC culture run amok without really questioning the underlying assumptions or providing alternative perspectives.
So they were giving a platform to these often exaggerated or distorted stories without doing the due diligence of fact-checking or seeking out different viewpoints.
It's a classic case of if it bleeds, it leads. Sensational stories that tap into fear and outrage tend to get more attention, and this created a feedback loop where these anecdotes about political correctness were constantly being amplified and validated.
And this brings us to Dinesh D'Souza. He was a major figure in the PC panic, right? His book, Illiberal Education, was a cornerstone of this whole movement.
Yeah, D'Souza's book was filled with examples of supposed political correctness gone wild on college campuses. But what's fascinating is that many of these articles and profiles about D'Souza completely glossed over his own history of controversial actions.
Wait, what do you mean? Fill me in?
Well, during his time as editor of the Dartmouth Review, a conservative campus newspaper, he published an interview with former KKK leader David Duke,
Oh, wow.
ran a parody of Black English, and even outed gay students.
Wow. That's incredibly hypocritical, to say the least. He was literally using his platform to attack and marginalize the very groups he claimed to be defending.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? And yet major publications were giving him a platform to spread his ideas without really acknowledging his track record or potential biases.
So the very person who was decrying political correctness was engaging in some pretty intolerant behavior himself.
It's a glaring example of how the media often failed to scrutinize the people who were driving this moral panic. They were more interested in presenting these sensational stories than in providing a balanced and nuanced perspective.
Okay, so we've talked about the players and the media's role, but let's get into the specifics. What were some of the actual anecdotes that fueled the PC panic, and how did they hold up under scrutiny?
That's a great question. And to answer that, we need to look at some of the most infamous cases that made headlines back then.
Like the Stephen Thernstrom case at Harvard. That one was everywhere.
Ah, yes, the Thernstrom affair. It was presented as this chilling example of how PC culture was stifling academic freedom. But as with many of these stories, the reality is far more complex.
Okay, I'm all ears. Set the scene for me. What actually happened?
Well, Thernstrom was a Harvard professor who taught a course on race relations in America. The media narrative was that he was essentially bullied into canceling his course by overly sensitive students who couldn't handle his views on race.
So the classic professor silenced by liberal snowflakes trope. But you're saying there's more to this story.
Oh, absolutely. There's always more to the story.
There's always more to the story.
Oh, yeah.
So fill me in. What happened with this Thernstrom guy?
Okay, so the New York Magazine article about this, incident paints this very dramatic picture of Thernstrom like being haunted by whispers of racist as he walks through campus. It claims that students accused him of being insensitive, like for using terms like Indian instead of Native American, and for assigning readings that didn't present a perfectly balanced view of slavery.
So the implication was that these were just minor slip-ups.
Yeah.
Like blown way out of proportion by these overly sensitive students.
Exactly. And the story goes that Thernstrom, feeling besieged by these complaints, ends up canceling his course to avoid further harassment. It's a classic David and Goliath narrative, like the lone professor standing up for truth and academic freedom against a mob of angry students.
But you're telling me that's not the whole story?
Not even close.
Oh, okay.
John Wiener, he was the former chair of Harvard's history department, actually investigated this case, and he uncovered a very different picture.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. What did Wiener find?
Well, it turns out that Thernstrom's experience was far less dramatic than the media portrayed it. Only one student had actually complained about the course content. Her name was Paula Ford.
Oh, wow.
And she didn't demand that he cancel the class. She didn't even call him a racist.
So what was her issue with the course?
Well, she felt that some of Thernstrom's comments about Black families and poverty were offensive and inaccurate. For instance, he allegedly stated that Black men beat their wives, leading to family breakups and higher poverty rates. And get this, he even suggested that the students read Toni Morrison to confirm his claims.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, I know.
That's incredibly problematic.
Exactly. And Ford went through the proper channels to address her concerns, She first approached the Committee on Race Relations,
Okay.
and then she even spoke directly with Thernstrom in his office.
So she wasn't exactly leading a mob of angry students, was she?
Not at all. They had a civil conversation, agreed to disagree, and that seemed to be the end of it.
So how did this, minor disagreement morph into this national story about PC censorship?
Well, a reporter from the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper, got wind of the situation and wrote a fairly balanced article about it.
Yeah.
The article actually included a quote from another student, Wendy Grantham. Yes, that Wendy Grantham, the actress who also found some of the course content racially insensitive.
Wait, Wendy Grantham from The Wire? No way!
Small world, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, Grantham hadn't even complained to Thernstrom directly, but she did corroborate Ford's concerns when asked by the reporter.
Okay, so two students expressed their concerns, and one of them even spoke to Thernstrom directly. This still doesn't seem like a witch hunt.
It doesn't. But Thernstrom's reaction was completely disproportionate.
Oh, okay.
He immediately published a letter in the Crimson accusing the students of conducting a witch hunt and refusing to engage in rational discussion.
He went straight for the victim card, didn't he?
He did. And what's even more revealing is that Thernstrom later admitted that what he really wanted was for the dean of students to publicly support him and silence the students' complaints.
Oh, wow.
He wanted the university administration to intervene in an intellectual dispute and take his side.
The irony's pretty thick, isn't it?
Yeah.
The person claiming to be a victim of censorship was actually seeking to censor opposing viewpoints.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It perfectly illustrates the hypocrisy at the heart of the PC panic, and it highlights how these narratives were often constructed and manipulated to fit a particular agenda.
The Thernstrom case is just one example, but it really shows how this whole PC panic relied on distorted narratives and exaggerated claims to create a sense of crisis where none really existed.
Right.
It's a reminder that we should always be critical of the stories we hear, especially when they're being used to justify sweeping generalizations or political agendas.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about how the PC panic distorted narratives about race, higher education, and even free speech. But there's another issue that was deeply entangled in this panic, the debate over date rape.
Oh, yeah, this was a particularly contentious topic in the 90s. It's hard to believe now, but the very concept of date rape was often met with skepticism and even ridicule.
Right. It was like society was struggling to grasp the fact that sexual assault could happen outside of that stereotypical stranger in the dark alley scenario.
It really was.
Yeah.
The idea that someone could be raped by someone they knew, someone they were dating, was often dismissed as feminist hysteria or an overreaction to a relatively minor incident.
And instead of focusing on the very real issue of sexual assault on college campuses and the systemic factors that contribute to it,
Yeah.
the conversation got hijacked by this moral panic about overly sensitive feminists.
Exactly. The narrative became less about supporting survivors and holding perpetrators accountable, and more about protecting men from false accusations and the supposed excesses of radical feminism.
And as with so many aspects of the PC panic, they relied on anecdotes to make their case, right?
Yeah, anecdotes and carefully curated narratives that reinforce their worldview.
Hmm.
One of the most prominent examples is the story of Katie Kostner. Her case became this lightning rod for the whole debate about date rape.
For those who aren't familiar with her story, can you give us a quick recap?
Sure. Katie was a freshman at William and Mary College when she was raped by a fellow student.
Like,
She bravely reported the assault, but the university's response was appalling. They essentially brushed it off, even suggesting that Katie should reconcile with her rapist.
It's infuriating how often institutions fail to protect survivors and even end up blaming them for their own assaults.
Yeah, it really is.
It speaks to a broader cultural problem, this deeply ingrained tendency to disbelieve women and minimize their experiences. But Katie didn't stay silent. She went public with her story, and it became national news. She even appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1991. But instead of focusing on the systemic issues that allowed her assault to happen and the inadequate response from the university, the media often framed her case as part of this broader debate about date rape hysteria.
Yeah, they question whether what happened to Katie was really rape because she had invited the young man into her dorm room.
Oh, wow.
It was the classic he said, she said dynamic, and Katie was often portrayed as either a liar or an oversensitive drama queen.
It's sickening how they used her trauma to further their own agenda. They twisted her story to fit this narrative of feminists overreacting and turning men into villains.
It is.
Yeah.
And even when the university admitted that Katie had been sexually assaulted, the punishment they gave her assailant was laughably lenient.
Really?
Yeah, he was simply barred from entering her residence hall for the rest of the semester.
It's almost like they were saying, boys will be boys, and women should just accept it as part of the college experience.
Oh, that was the underlying message, and it was incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
Katie's case should have been a wake-up call about the prevalence of sexual assault on campuses and the need for universities to take these allegations seriously. But instead, it became fodder for this moral panic about overly sensitive feminists.
It's a reminder of how important it is to be critical of the media and to challenge these narratives that seek to silence survivors and protect perpetrators.
It is, and it's also a reminder of how easily we can fall into these binary ways of thinking where it's either men are all monsters or women are all liars. The reality is far more complex, and we need to be willing to engage that complexity if we want to create a safer and more just society.
And it's not just about sexual assault. This tendency to dismiss women's experiences and portray them as overly emotional or hysterical is a pervasive problem that extends far beyond the PC panic.
Absolutely. It's rooted in sexism and misogyny, and it's something we need to constantly challenge and dismantle.
Well, this conversation has been incredibly insightful, but we're running out of time for this segment. Stay tuned, though, because we've got more to uncover as we continue our deep dive into the 1990s PC panic. So before the break, we were talking about how the PC panic often twisted narratives about sexual assault.
Yeah, to fit a particular agenda.
Exactly.
It's a classic example of how moral panics can derail important conversations and distract from the real issues.
And it's not just about sexual assault. This whole panic had a chilling effect on open discourse, didn't it? Like, people became afraid to express certain opinions or even use certain words, for fear of being labeled insensitive or offensive.
It did. This climate of fear and self-censorship really took hold in the 90s. It's like everyone was walking on eggshells, constantly worried about saying the wrong thing.
And it's interesting because one of the big talking points of the PC panic was that conservatives were the real victims of censorship, that their free speech rights were being trampled on by these liberal thought police. But looking back, did any of those slippery slope predictions that they were so worried about actually come true?
Well, that's the thing. They largely didn't. All those fears about political correctness spiraling out of control and leading to some kind of Orwellian dystopia, well, those predictions mostly fizzled out.
It's like they cried wolf and people eventually started to tune them out.
In a way, yes. But the damage was already done. The PC panic had sown this deep distrust of universities and liberal elites, and it created this atmosphere of suspicion and hostility that we're still grappling with today.
So this, like, manufactured crisis about political correctness had very real and lasting consequences.
Absolutely. And one of the most significant outcomes was the defunding of universities.
Wait, really? How did that happen?
Well, conservative lawmakers, fueled by this narrative of universities as liberal indoctrination centers, started slashing funding for higher education. They argued that universities were wasting taxpayer dollars on frivolous programs and promoting radical ideologies.
And this had real-world consequences for students and faculty, right?
Definitely. Tuition costs skyrocketed, class sizes increased, and many universities were forced to cut programs and lay off staff.
So this panic, this manufactured crisis about political correctness, actually contributed to the financial struggles that higher education is facing today.
It was a major contributing factor. And the irony is, while conservatives were busy complaining about the supposed excesses of liberalism on campus, they were simultaneously undermining the very institutions that were meant to foster critical thinking and intellectual debate.
It's like they shot themselves in the foot.
Exactly. They created this self-fulfilling prophecy. By portraying universities as bastions of liberalism, they justified cutting their funding, which then forced universities to become more reliant on private donations and corporate partnerships, which furthered the perception that they were out of touch with the average American.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is, and it's not just about funding. This PC panic also had a profound impact on how we talk about and understand complex issues. It created this environment where nuanced discussion was replaced by sound bites and outrage.
It's like everything got reduced to these simplistic black and white arguments.
And that's a real problem because most important issues aren't black and white. They're complex and require careful consideration of different perspectives.
So what can we learn from all of this? How can we avoid falling prey to these kinds of moral panics in the future?
Well, I think one key takeaway is the importance of critical thinking. We need to be skeptical of sensationalized stories and question the motives of those who are pushing them.
Especially when those stories play into our existing biases and anxieties.
Exactly. We also need to be aware of how easily anecdotes can be manipulated to create a false sense of crisis. Just because someone has a bad experience doesn't mean it's representative of a larger trend.
It's like that old saying, the plural of anecdote is not data. We can't draw sweeping conclusions based on a few isolated incidents.
Right, right. And we can't forget the role that the media plays in shaping these narratives. We need to demand more from our news sources. We need journalism that is rigorous, nuanced, and committed to presenting a full and accurate picture of complex issues.
Not just clickbait headlines and sensationalized stories designed to generate outrage and clicks.
Well said. And I think it's also important to remember that language is constantly evolving. What might be considered offensive today might be perfectly acceptable tomorrow, and vice versa. We need to be open to that evolution and not get too hung up on the words themselves.
The focus should be on intent, right?
Yeah,
Are these words being used to promote understanding or to cause harm?
precisely. And that brings us to another important lesson from the PC panic. The power of listening to and empathizing with those who have different experiences than our own.
So much of this panic was fueled by fear of the other, fear of those who were perceived as different or threatening.
And that fear often prevented people from really listening to and understanding the perspectives of those they disagreed with.
Yeah.
It created this echo chamber where people only heard their own views reflected back at them.
And that's such a dangerous place to be, isn't it? Because it closes off the possibility of learning, of growth, of finding common ground.
It does. And that's why it's so important to actively seek out different perspectives, to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views, and to be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Well, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. It's amazing how this panic from decades ago still resonates with us today.
It does, doesn't it? It shows us how these cycles of fear and outrage are nothing new. But by understanding the dynamics of moral panics, we can hopefully be more critical and discerning consumers of information and avoid falling prey to the same traps.
So the next time you find yourself getting swept up in a moral panic, take a step back, question the narrative, and remember the lessons we've learned from the 90s PC panic.
Yeah, challenge your own assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, and don't be afraid to have those uncomfortable conversations. That's how we move forward.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the 1990s PC panic. It's been a real pleasure exploring this topic with you.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.